community. Okay, we're ready.
Well, let us. Yes, good evening. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this panel here, the Blue Metropolis panel at the Salon du Livre, Women Writers in the Americas. Well, beyond the mighty pen, women activists and writers in the Americas. We have here two fabulous, fabulous women writers and activists from the two tips of the New World, one in Canada, over here in Toronto. I'm actually in Montreal. In a second, I'm going to do the land acknowledgement. And the other in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. So first, I'd like to do the land acknowledgement and then we'll start. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are located on unceded indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. And on that note, welcome everyone once again, good evening. So this again will be a panel where we're going to be exchanging experiences, thoughts, ideas, what worked and what didn't work in efforts from both of these women that are also activists, that are very active in anti-racist work and feminist work. So basically the idea is to have a conversation, an informal conversation where we also, where we mostly discuss, again, our experiences and our, how we feel about, how we feel about what we do, just in general, the people behind the pen and the activism. So I suppose we would start with Cheryl so that Ceci could get a little sense of the Canadian experience. I had the pleasure of meeting Cheryl when we were both doctoral candidates at McGill University 10 years ago. We've worked on quite a few projects together, including producing an issue on journalism. Cheryl was the editor of a journal, of a scholarly journal, scholarly publication that we had in the department. And Cheryl has always been very involved. Cheryl's also, one of the most visible faces out there media-wise. She has TED Talks and she writes op-eds for the New York Times. She's kind of like our spokesperson for Canadian racism issues, but anyway, Cheryl's also had many lives as well. In addition to academia, she had a life before being a scholar. So Cheryl, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about yourself, but around what the word activism means to you. How do you see yourself? How does it inform your work? Or how is your work informed by activism? What does it mean to do activism for you, for Cheryl Thompson?
Okay, yes, Ingrid, thank you. And I don't know if you remember, I was actually your teaching assistant.
Well, I was going to say that, but see, Cheryl's, Cheryl, very prestigious postdoctoral story.
Yeah, but we all have to start somewhere. We all have to start somewhere. That's where I started.
It's funny because, I was going to say that, but then I'm not going to say that because I don't want to appear like I'm bragging, And also this week, as we're celebrating Maya Johnson becoming the first Black anchor in Montreal, was also my student. So I feel it's quite the bragging moment.
There you go.
Surrounded by all these women that, but anyway, so Cheryl, I would love to hear about your experience.
Yeah. So, like you said, I started in a professional career, like sort of I would say a normative trajectory of someone. You went to university and then you got a job and I was talking to my sister earlier today and we were just reflecting on that life. And she's like, that wasn't you. Like the 8 years you worked professionally, that was not you. And then I said to her, no, that was a performance. So I was performing a normative role as a young adult working in these jobs. And then what led me to academia truly was because I just felt like I was never reading anything that was about me. I never read anything that was from my point of view as a Black woman. I never read anything that was about me as a Canadian Black person. I never read anything that was critical of our systems and structures as they have been existing. And also anything that acknowledged the fact that so much of our history has been erased and sanitized. And I just never read anything. And I thought, I never read anything that resonated with me because there were scholars doing critical race work, but I always felt disconnected from their work too. So my activism for me is instead of waiting for other people to do it, I just decided I was going to do it. And I decided that when I was like 30. I said, from now on in life, I'm going to do it. I'm not going to wait for other people to do it. And I'm not going to sit around and go to a cafe and talk about what people aren't doing. if I have the idea that it's not being done, I literally say to myself, how could I do it? And so what I've done, I feel, in my academic career since being a PhD student 10 years ago, well, now it's 11 years because I started my PhD at McGill in 2009 when I lived in Montreal. That was 11 years ago. I've kind of said to myself, maybe not initially consciously, but subconsciously, I said I was writing into being my story. So everything I do, every talk, even this, every paper, every conference, I'm writing myself into being, and I'm writing myself and then others who see themselves in me into being. Now, you asked the question about activism. Most people see activism as the first root of that word, action. So taking to the streets in a protest or boycotting something, right? Something really that is overtly seemingly to be an act of resistance. For me, I see activism in the longer sense of the word. So not an initial response. I see activism as a lifelong journey. And it's a lifelong journey to speak truth to power in every form. So for me, I'm an activist in the classroom. I say things in the classroom that most people would never say. I push my students to do things that they would never say. You know, I might not be on the protest. And as you know, Ingrid, I suffered an injury like about a year, almost 2 years ago now, that makes my mobility quite difficult. So I literally won't be on the protest with you, but believe me, I'll use my voice to write about it. And I'm always using my voice to basically to get people to be uncomfortable with the normalcy of life. Because for me, the normal, when people are saying, I just want things to get back to normal, I think to myself, so then you must be okay with oppressive structures, with systemic injustices, like all the stuff that you're basically saying you want that to return. And what I'm here to say is actually, I want to disrupt that, and for us to start reimagining a different world where we actually can get to a place where equity is actually realized. Because as you know, we're nowhere near that. People think we've overcome all these things, but the fact that Kamala Harris is going to be vice president and everyone's acting like that's such an amazing accomplishment, it is, but you should step back and say, in the 21st century, this is the first time any woman has ever reached not the first position, but the second position in the most powerful country in the world. Meanwhile, around the world, there's been women leaders for decades. Like, there's a polarity there. So what I'm saying to you is that we have a lot of work to do, and it doesn't just end when the protest on the street ends, for me.
Thank you, Cheryl. Wow, so much to connect here from based on what you said with Ceci. But I'd like Ceci to do the same exercise to talk about, Ceci, how your activism came about, how it informs your work, how your work informs it, and what it relates. But do touch, if you can, Ceci, a little bit on the idea of writing yourself an autobiography that Cheryl mentioned, because I know that that's also very present, and it's an approach that Ceci uses as well, the autobiographical notion, or the self, and as a place of resistance, as a site of resistance, or as a site of to articulate these injustices and this call for change. So, Ceci, go ahead and please enlighten us.
It was a pleasure to listen to Cheryl. I can subscribe like every line of her speech. So we are pretty much in synchronicity. And the thing is, as a writer and as a cultural worker, I always work on the first person, the autobiography. And actually, I publish my books, and also I have this kind of interviews with writers and artists, and I publish 2 books on a selection of personal autobiographical histories. And then I have a TV program called Confesionario, a joke, and how to confess personal stuff, and then a radio program. And so different formats for the same idea of writers and artists write about themselves. But then, like 3 years ago, I went to a meeting of a kind of artists, feminist artists in the fight. And then I realized that as soon as everyone tell stories, it was like the biographies interconnected. So the activism, it's our story, but who has a connection with the story of the woman, of the girl, of the, of some of the diversity. It's a connection of the personal and the social. So that was my step as a writer, as a believer on autobiography and personal story. And then I realized that feminism has this space for for the singular and the plural. So that was my enter to the activism world.
Thank you, Ceci. Thank you for sharing as well. And I'm glad that that you're both synchronizing. So you've both had very, very busy, years with recently. In 2018 was huge for one of the causes that Ceci. Now we're going to get a little bit into specific causes. Ceci works at a National Institute Against Racism and Xenophobia in Argentina. And Ceci, if you could share a little bit with us about what this institute is, because there's nothing like it here in Canada. It would be really interesting to hear from that perspective, and especially I'd love Cheryl to hear about it. But I'd like both of you to talk a little bit about your personal most recent year, being Black Lives Matter, here for 2020, and in 2018, the big year of militancy for reproductive rights in Argentina, and your recent struggles. And I'd like you both to tell me where you're at today in the pandemic, but recently in general, in terms of mood, in terms of hopefulness or not. This is this series is called Mémoire pour l'Espoir, or the idea of hope for the there's an element of hope in this in all these conversations that we're having about racism and discrimination. So I'd like both of you to tell me a little bit about where you're personally at. What are you hoping for right now? Where are you recovering from something? Are you planning? Are you attacking right now? Are you on the defense? Are you staying put? With the course of the pandemic, where are you at in terms of actual work? What are you guys involved in? Both. So Cheryl, if you could start, and then Ceci.
Yeah, I'll just reflect, a bit on what you mentioned. Obviously, for me, the summer of 2020, everyone suddenly woke up to this realization of the ways in which police interact with Black people. However, if we think about it, the incident with Trayvon Martin happened in 2013. And you could even go back to cases in the 90s, right? In the 80s, in the 70s, in the 60s, in the 50s. The reality is that there is a long, long history of all of this. But, for me, what I have found most troubling, and it's something that in my own practice, I'm trying to write a different script, is how in the North American context anyway, I can't speak to the Latin America context as much, but there's this script suddenly where we're now equating anything Black with social justice. So that's the only way that you could actually be heard as a Black person, is if you're talking about your entanglements with police or the criminal justice system. And the reality is that has nothing to do with being a Black person. The way we are treated in those institutions is one thing, but us as individuals is a completely different thing. So for me, part of my reframing is to get people, and how I think I've been also when I'm engaging with young students, to get them to realize you don't have to hold this as a burden on your shoulders, that anytime something comes up and there's a conversation about policing, everyone's looking to you as the Black person to speak on behalf of this particular issue, right? And so for me, I've been trying to get us to think a lot about Black joy and wellness, and what does that look like? What does it mean to be in joy and in bliss? And what does it mean to be in wellness? And at Ryerson, as part of it, just so happened over the whole summer that I have become part of a working equity, diversity, and inclusion group. Essentially, we don't want to call it a task force because I hate that word. It sounds too military. We have a lot of military language as it relates to committee work. And so I try to stay away from the military language. So we're calling ourselves like a committee. And we're basically tasked for the first time at Ryerson, the Faculty of Communication and Design, to actually have a plan of inclusion, of diversity and equity, not just responding to incidences when they happen and then being all panicked because you don't know what to do, to actually start to strategically think about making EDI, as we call it for short, part of the fabric of what we do. And so for me, being part of that committee the last 6 months has just been extremely rewarding, because I believe while you need activism from below on the ground, you also need a kind of top-down shift. So within the institutions themselves, there has to be a shift of culture. If you just have people on the street and no institutional shift, nothing changes. I think in the American context, if we go back to the 1960s, if you didn't have Lyndon Johnson pass the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and other legislative changes, all the work of civil rights activism would have been completely for nothing. They had coinciding institutional change to coincide with their civil, quote unquote, disobedience, as they wanted to label it. If you don't have institutional change, and I think that's the reason why Black Lives Matter, there's a lot of struggle with Black Lives Matter, because people are like, oh, we don't need that, and they're so useless. And the reason is because the mandate of Black Lives Matter, if we compare it to the mandate of the civil rights movement, the civil rights movement had a very clear mandate. They wanted legislative change. They wanted legal change. They wanted full citizenship rights. That was on the table as early as the 1950s. Black Lives Matter, we're still trying to figure out what the ask is other than see us, honor us. We don't know what is the legislative ask of that movement. And I think that's why it struggles sometimes the way people take it up, because the ask doesn't seem to be structural ask, right? It seems to be more on an interpersonal, cultural, and yes, political, but there isn't a policy ask. And I think that's where I'm at with activism, to really start to think about, well, what do we need in the 21st century as it relates to changing our structures and our systems? It can't just be hashtags and t-shirts, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I could not agree more. In fact, because I'm teaching an intro to communication class, to communication theory class, and I speak to Cheryl as a scholar most of the time. But basically, the way that I teach the class also is by talking about how the discipline is instituted. And in the 60s, in particular, there are all kinds of knowledges that go into audience research or into our field because of these groundbreaking, because of feminist scholarship, because of civil rights scholarship, because of sociology, because of all these fields in both the East Coast and the West Coast. And, I find it interesting when we talk about the public sphere that some of my students, to them, it's something, it's such a foreign concept. And then, or the idea that everybody's connected by a text. And then, and when, I told them to watch the trial, the Chicago 7, and I said, how Abby Hoffman is talking about Herbert Marcuse, right? And I said, Marcuse is one of the Frankfurt scholars. And I said, they barely want to get to the Wikipedia entry, to them, this is so disconnected from the intellectual ideals. And I keep saying this entire movement, 1968, Danny LaRouge in Paris, was totally connected to students, So I said, as much as this is a tragedy, we're talking before with Cheryl about how the pandemic is also opportunities, or how the teaching online is not, it's a different platform, And in a sense, there is a crisis, there is the isolation, but we're not fighting the Vietnam War, we're not, I think in many ways, it's so much easier to, we're bored at home and we could mobilize. If we got it together, I think this is a an opportunity. There's a lot of potential for hope, right? I think people just feel hopeless because we're not meeting in person, but I think we're more, I don't know. I just think that my biggest challenge has been to engage the students politically in the sense of just being passionate about these ideas and not just feeling like it's a drag of a text that they have to go through, right? Cheryl, you want to?
Well, I mean, just to add on, I mean, to me, I'm trying to get students to see, hey, look how we can all kind of start to see how even in Canada that we celebrate our healthcare system as being the beacon of the world, how you can see how our healthcare system can't respond to this, how it's even failing. Now let's take that and extrapolate that to every system, education, social justice, the criminal justice system, healthcare. All of those institutions, as I always remind people, were created at the same time in the 19th century. So if we can see that healthcare is failing, that means we should just assume every other institution is failing too. And they are. And why is that? It's because we're in the 21st century clinging to 19th century structures and systems. And then when you say that, people are like, yeah, but we can't change them, right? Like I put on my Twitter the other day, defund the police, but we need the police. Well, okay, but we're dealing with a police system that was created 200 some odd years ago. Like, don't you think it's time we start to change and think about things that actually fit this system that we're in? And right now in the 21st century, we're in a digital world. Think about all the institutions I just told you. They are not in a digital world. They're acting as if it's 1940s, 1950s in so many ways. And so, that's part of the conversation. It's like, how come we can't just recognize that things are not working? That's it.
And also, I remember also the 19th century because it's one of the things that we used to talk about in terms of the modern era, right? I mean, everything exactly, and even the idea of communication itself as this idea of connecting to people comes from the 19th century, right? Everything. And it's as John Durham Peters puts it, a registry of modern longings. We're all sitting here alone, longing for that connection, longing to belong, but also from a very individualistic perspective, right? If we just did away with all of that and thought about everybody's well-being and thought about the other and thought about not just one success, but think more in terms of a community. I think the possibilities are endless. I mean, I think we are in a moment where we have to do away absolutely with these structures and to dismantle. I mean, obviously this has not gotten us to a good place. I mean, capitalism or the environment, we're just, it's obviously more, and we've tried everything, peaceful resistance, I mean, civil disobedience, and it hasn't worked. Martin Luther King was shot, so then how do we rethink and how do we keep going, in terms of a strategy that works? Ceci, tell us a little bit about where you're at. Yes.
I was thinking about this relation in between government, states, legislation, laws, and street, la calle, as we said, the march, demonstrations, all stuff. At this point, we are really in a mixed situation. We need both desperately. For instance, our new president, who started like this year, on March this year, he promised to sanction the abortion legal law, the pro-choice law, but it comes the pandemic, so it was a great excuse to postpone. But the situation is getting horrible for the abortion illegal in the pandemic. It's worst. I mean, it's not like you can postpone, because the girls and women and kids who must have an abortion, being by maybe chemic pills or whatever, needs right now, and in middle of the pandemic, it's really much more difficult to do it in the illegal way. So we have the president who's supposed to be up to. We have a new Ministry of Women and Dissidents, as we call, and we have this from the city, from the different towns, for the national. So we have a lot of women in Congress, like we have equity, half and half, and then I will explain, because it's never half and half, but it's going to this part. We have a vice president who happened to be 2 terms president, who is a woman. And so we have a pretty good stuff on, but at the same time, we have the Pope, which happened to be Argentinian. So that is not a good thing for the abortion law, because he won't be happy with that. And we have a global situation in which countries that already have, like the states, some states and some countries want to go back, like in Poland, like in some states of the States, in France, there are like a huge right, very conservative, kind of fascist movement in the global picture, which is using the abortion, the free choice, as a key, as a tool to convince, to manipulate like people's emotion and show that, well, this is start with the abortion and then it's going to be, pandemonium. I mean, it's chaos and it's going to be everything bad. So we don't have in a very good scenario, world scenario to push for the law. So finally, we were waiting, like we are not going to push on the president, on the vice president, on the representative, which supposed to be support us. But to a point, we decide to go not to streets, but to the, this kind of marathon, which I come from, and to do all kind of, virtual demonstrations and push it. And, we did a lot of effort this weekend. And on Monday, someone for the government announced they are going to present the law at the Senate, at the Senate of the Chamber of Senate. So, I mean, if they have, I don't know, in this case, we need both. I mean, if the politicians can show to other ones, like the street or the push of the willing of the voters, maybe some representative who are like, I mean, not imprecise, they don't know what to do, what they prefer. They say, okay, look at this, all these people asking. So as you ask, Ingrid, the real situation today, it's why like day by day, pushing and receiving. And I think we are going to be good. But I don't think if we didn't start to push and to scream and to fight, even if we have a very, very good feminist representative at different, in the legislatura and, in ministries, and they have a huge new number of women in politics working and being for the states. If you don't support them, and it's very difficult even for them to show and to convince the other politicians that we need to do that. So at this time, we are working in a way on virtual streets and pushing and screaming and reading and doing whatever. And at the same time, I am at the INADI, which is this national agency, which is who is in, it's before the against racism and discrimination and xenophobia. And we, as part of the government, we start to rethink our own problems in the government, like, the way they choose people to work in dependencias estatales. So we are also taking responsibility for us being here. That is not has to be like something of blah, 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 but it has to be something to change legislation and to change some rules. So I think it's a two sides in Argentina go side by side. I mean, you need absolutely both. Argentinian society, it's very much one who is every single week in the streets for any, protesting. I think maybe in France it's the same, but it's not that common. But it get a result. I mean, but with a combination. I mean, I completely agree with you. I mean, the serious change is, even if we are in this democratic system, the real change happened in these chambers with the sign of the new laws.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ceci. In that sense, Buenos Aires is very similar to Montreal, the manif and the manifestation culture that we have here, the protests, the taking to the streets. It's very similar.
But that way also?
Yes, and Montreal is very, because again, a lot of the rights that we have here in Montreal is a very feminist, I would say, city. A lot of them, we have a subsidized daycare, we have maternity leave, we have, we've had abortion legalized for, I think, 30 years now, a long time. But it's a fight also that was won in the Quiet Revolution in the 60s, largely by the feminist, by the intellectuals, but also by the breaking from both the Anglo oppression and the Catholic Church. And I think it was, again, largely a part of the 60s movement in general. And the results are here. I mean, this is what, every time I'm teaching with my students, I tell them, I would not be able to be here if I didn't have subsidized daycare. It's as simple as that. If I had to pay for the care of my children, or if I had to have them running around, I wouldn't be able to do it. And this is, it's clear systematic work that was done to make sure that we have this right. It's very, very important work, and it's to work within the system. I wanted to talk a little bit about this being a feminist, we both, all of us, the three of us, having a feminist perspective. I wanted to talk a little bit about, within the lines of the personal being political, a little bit about the emotional toll and the personal side of it in terms of your relationship with friends and family. And speaking of this, because one of the bands from my generation back in the day is, well, like a little bit there, I would guess the generation kind of in front of me, but anyway, maybe Gen X too, but it's a band called Me Mom and Morgenthaler. Morgenthaler is the person that was responsible for not responsible, but had a key role in legalizing abortion in Quebec. It's a band called Me Mom and Morgenthaler, and they have a song called If You Have a Racist, well, that goes, if you have a racist friend, now is the time for that friendship to end. And it's like, and the rhythm is really cute because it says, be it your mother, be it your sister, people that are really close to me. And every time I'm scrolling down my Facebook feed, I feel like pressing the defriend button. And again, the people I grew up with elected Bolsonaro by a landslide. Bolsonaro yesterday, my paper was referring to a speech that he made, telling that we have to stop being like the gay slur for gay men, with the F. I mean, like literally. I mean, imagine Trump doesn't even, when they call him the Trump of the tropics, I think Bolsonaro has a long way to go to get to Trump, and this is acceptable, this is about my friends, the people I grew up with are the people that voted for him, So and it's, and in Brazil especially, it's very divisive. People families communicate on WhatsApp groups, and there's all kinds of like fights that go on, because again, the political divisions are so pronounced. And then here in Canada, we have our own issues that I find, especially with what is known as the Latinx community, our community here, is that, we're supposed to be seen as this one giant blob that thinks the same, when there's nothing more divided than Latin Americans. Really, we think so differently. And when you have issues of exclusion and, like, for example, when you have men that are openly, anti-choice, that are poets, I tell them openly, look, you can go and read your poetry somewhere else, but I'm not going to give you the stage. Sorry, find it. Because anyway, my point is that when you have friends, or in the case of writers, or in the case of colleagues that you disagree with, because I don't want to say because that they're wrong, and especially also in academia, Cheryl, as I was telling Ceci this morning, there's this ridiculous debate going on around the usage of the N-word that is just so poorly. What irritates me is like how poorly articulated it is, how dishonest and disingenuous it is. And if I hear one more white person quoting Daniela Ferrière out of context and say it's the equivalent of like, but I have a black friend, you know, like the concept of negritude in Brazil or negritude in France has nothing to do with the N-word. I mean, it's like a cultural. I mean, I don't know. It's just annoying that this has to happen at the institutional level when you start giving attention to this stuff, you actually lose sight of what really has to be instituted, like new programs, new professor, like new, you know, what actually should be done. I think it's such a waste of time and counterproductive, you know. And sure, I'd love you to speak a little bit about this in terms of this particular moment that we're at, because you are a Black scholar also, and the emotional toll that must take on you, because I can't imagine. I mean, me, for example, I just get so frustrated and having to explain this, or I just tune off. I'm like, honestly, I thought at what point this is not going to be academic. I mean, this is not an issue of freedom of speech. And I say this because, for example, 20 years ago, when I was shown the movie Night and Fog by Alain Resnais, it was done with a warning. It wasn't just images of the Holocaust being retweeted as with no preamble, no, you know, just no sensitivity. So why are we doing this to, you know, the video of George Floyd? Again, for journalists, that's supposed to be evidence. I'm teaching journalism. I refuse to watch that video. I don't see how, you know, and these conversations just aren't being had at the level that I would expect to have at the university. And I find it's very frustrating. I find myself in silent whispers with colleagues that like, you know, that I would go to Cheryl, like, can you believe this stuff? You know, in a way that, you know, that I find is very, it's demoralizing. It's horrible. And Cheryl, if you could speak a little bit about how you feel, you know, in terms of how this affects you, you know, on a daily basis, in the work that you do at the university, especially in a moment right now with all these debates, you know,
Right. So, I mean, first to the point about like losing people or having to like end friendships or relationships. I actually don't even look at it that way. I just look at it like, you know, Oprah, actually, I think Oprah, she might have been citing someone else, but she talked about the fact that if you think about when a rocket ship is going out into space, right? It's ascending. Every certain altitudes, it has to drop things. Things have to shed from the rocket to actually get out into the atmosphere, right? That's how I look at losing those people. I'm a rocket, I'm ascending. And when I start to elevate myself, it actually makes sense that people start to drop off. And yes, they could be family, but the reality is that there's your blood family that you're born into, and then there's a family that you make. And just because you're born with a set of people doesn't mean they're meant to take the journey to outer space with you. Excuse the analogy, right? It just doesn't mean they're meant to help you climb. So when people leave my life, I say good riddance, goodbye. I deadbolt that symbolic door, and then I put the shutters down so they can't see me and they can't return unless they do their own work, and then they meet me on the same level. As for the N-word, here's the thing in Canadian universities, and I know it's the same thing in the Francophone world as it is in the Anglophone world. They cling to freedom of speech. They cling to freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and they cling to this ideal as being some ideal of democracy, that we can't let this go, because if they start telling us what we can say and can't say, then it's like there's no democracy anymore. And we saw that play out with the Charlie Hebdo situation in France, right? That is still playing out even today. That, like we should be able to say what we want and to caricature who we want. And what it fundamentally boils down to is an inability to see through the eyes of other. It is in my world, I still call it an empathy gap. That's really what it is. It's an empathy gap. So you ostensibly cannot see the point of view of Black people as it relates to that word. They just can't see the point of view. And yes, to your point, there's been so much written and so many conversations, they still refuse to see it. And why do they refuse to see it? Because in their world, and I said this to a friend the other day when we were talking about this, I think there are a lot of white academics, Anglophone, Francophone, doesn't matter, in Canada, who really buy into the whole theories of meritocracy that have sort of taken over the university. Meritocracy goes along with neoliberalism. So it's this hyper sense of, I've worked hard to get here. I've studied. I have the right to say whatever I want to say in my writing and in my classroom. That's what they believe. They don't subscribe to the other side of the coin, which is the social democratic side of the coin, that, Black and Indigenous and racialized and LGBTQ plus people and the disabled, and I would say women, but some of the people using the N-word and defending it are actually white women, which is another thing. They don't realize that all of those groups have been denied access to this space longer than they've been included in this space. For even in my lifetime, it would have been very unusual when I was a kid to know a Black woman with a PhD. I would have thought, who is that? I would have thought they were like an alien. I would not even have known. Whereas in 2020, it's becoming a little bit more, it's not a weird oddity that there would be a Black woman with a PhD. Just 40 years ago, that would have been very strange. It's like, to me, what I'm saying to you is that the dominant cultures in our country, French and English, it seems to me that they have been in an amnesia about the absence of the others in their presence. But suddenly they are fully awoken when we are now in their presence. So they don't remember the times, all those decades that we were never there. Now, suddenly that we're here, it's like they're upset because we're here and we're saying things that they don't want us to say. Why are you, as an academic, I don't care your race, even fully using the N-word in a classroom? Like, why wouldn't you say what I just said, the N-word? Why would you feel the need to say the actual word? Like, to me, it's so bizarre. It doesn't even make any kind of sense. And then when Black students challenge you, you get all defensive. Like you pointed to, we have elevated our consciousness as it relates to anti-Jewish slurs, as it relates to anti-women slurs, as it relates to slurs that we refer to other ethnic and racial groups, Indigenous people. For whatever reason, that is the one word where people still think they have the right to say it. And here's my thinking on why they do. Because Black culture has produced this word, right, in our music and in our art. But then I also say, wait a second, queer used to be a slur. LGBTQ2 plus people reclaimed that word and also use it in a different way. They took it fully back. For whatever reason, the N-word, the reason it still stings in a different way than, say, the word queer stings, is because it's still a traumatic word. It can still be used as a tool of hate. And what most people don't know about the history, the genealogy of that word, when African descended people first came to the Americas, and I include North and South America in that discussion, that was the word that they used to call Black people. That was our name. We really didn't have an identity. We were just N-word. And maybe we had a first name, N-word Jim, N-word Betty. That's what they called us. And then through the decades, even in the United States, you will go into the legal text, you will see judges calling defendants N-word in cases in the 19th century, up until maybe the 1950s. A judge would have been referring to someone in a legal court and call them N-word. And so people don't understand how institutionally that word has been used as a violence. And then they say, well, why do Black people use it in hip hop? And they make it, and it's N-word, not and all these kinds of explanations. And it's like, first of all, even if that's true, rappers use it. Why do you still have to use it? Why do you think you can use it? Can't you just listen to the music and enjoy it? Why do you then think you have to use it? And if you can't use it, it's like your life is like those professors at the University of Ottawa. It's as if their work, they can't do their work now because they can't say the N-word. It doesn't make any sense at all. And you ask me how I cope with that. I cope with that because I know racism is, for me, is a kind of a disorder of the mind. I really think something is just wrong with these people. So that's how I get through it. I do not try to take it on. I do not try to make it my burden to change the person or to educate them. If you are looking at another human being and you don't see them as you see yourself, then something is wrong with you, is all I could say to you. And you have some work that you have to do. It's not my job to do the work for you. And I think I've heard many cases over the years of racists becoming reformed racists. So it can be done. And I think it's an active choice, period.
Thank you, Cheryl. Yeah, no, it is definitely. And yeah, it's the question is also when I mean, to me, it's when the other person refuses, when you're trying to educate them, and I mean, I constantly have a fight with my best friend because she doesn't believe that, my best friend, again, one that has to go eventually, but she doesn't believe that there's such a thing as white privilege or like white fragility, and she but to the point that she's using the term wrong, and she's actually really, really smart, and they just won't listen, and it's so frustrating, And the same thing, I was talking to Biella Coleman the other day. She came to speak in my class about J.K. Rowling producing all these, I mean, being on Twitter, using her platform to incite all this hate about a group of the transgenders that are particularly so fragile and so prone to, to mental illness. I mean, to depression. I mean, this is the last group that you want to attack. And you have a platform. So to go back to now the idea of activism and being intellectuals, you can't. It's not a question of Harry Potter being confused with the author. It's just that Harry Potter could be wonderful, etc. But the author has a very big platform, and if she starts spewing hate, and it's I don't know. It's at that point. It's anyway. I'm trying to stop myself from giving my input. I want to hear what you women have to say. Cheryl, yes, Cheryl, please.
It's important to know. J.K. Rowling, she says what she says because she's looking at it like, literally, I don't care about those people. They're not my target audience. They're not the people who are buying my books and reading my movies. So I'm just going to cater. I'm just going to say whatever I want to say and then hide behind the fact that I'm an artist. So I'm not political. So I think, for me, people need to just be very attuned. I'm one of those people. I've never bought any of those books. I've never seen any of the movies. I have never been to the theme park, and I don't plan on it. And that has there's other reasons why I've always been an anti-J.K. Rowling person. But this is just like proving that my instinct about her was right.
Well, there are also, I agree completely. I think it's a lack of empathy, and two things I thought about that. On one hand, we have another kind of problem with language because we, as English know, we very quick we invite the inclusive language, el idioma inclusivo. So we start to
and if I could just give a little bit of context to Cheryl, in Argentina, they're very advanced. As you know, Spanish is a Latin language, so the language is gendered. So now instead of using A and O, they use the E. So instead of amigos or amigas, it's amigues. And in Argentina, pretty much every time you write an email, I mean, to me, it's almost second nature, But I find,
believe it or not, I learned Spanish. I can't speak it very well, but I learned it a couple of years when I was young. So I know about how gendered. And I was always like, why is it so gendered? So that's interesting.
It's a very gendered language.
So now the question that you're going to get into is that changing anything? Or?
Yes, like you say, los chicos or las chicas, and now you say les chiques. Understand? So, and it's a big change. But I mean, I have a daughter who now is 15, but that started like when she was 11, more or less, like 5 years ago, or 4 years ago. And I have the feeling, the temperature about that this movement in language is something that the kids like very much and use a lot. I mean, they have the chance to be with same-sex person and to be bisexual. Most of them at 12, at 13, decide to be gay, decide to be trans, decide to try. But in real life, I mean, language is just an expression of their life. So older people who maybe are disconnected with this reality thought, I think, that maybe at INADI, at our agency, or maybe at the at some point in the state, some two or a group of people decide to impose, politically correctness and censorship and, and be coercive. But it's nothing like that. I mean, kids wants to talk in a way and teach their teachers and professors, and some professors start to change their mind. So some start to be very in synchronicity, and finally the language get changed, or at least, for instance, when we ask for the free abortion, we sign niñas, like girls, women, and varones trans, like gay males who has the capacity to be pregnant. And it was a discussion, and someone told me, well, why do you have to put, all the list that the binary, well, it's not me. And someone said, well, you're too politically correct. I fed up with you. And I said, it's not me. It's not my invention. I have a group of, trans males who asked me to be in there, and they are an aggregation. So they are a communion, a collective. There are a group of people who pretends to be named as the way they want. So there are some furious colleagues or intellectuals feeling restricted, but that is because they don't know nothing about the people who live in this community. So there are people who, don't want to be named as the way you want to name it. So you won't do it. It's like, I don't know, you won't go around the world naming people the way you want. You have some conventions and try the other persons the way this person wants to be treated. So this is the big mistake. These people have the feeling that there are some controlling, very censorship. I don't know. They think that it's in my case, that I am inventing this. But no, my daughter is calling that way, it's naming that way. This community asked me for that way to call themselves. So it's happening in life.
Thank you, Cecilia. And continuing, Cheryl, is there anything that you'd like to add about inclusive language or?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think as a native English speaker, like that is my quote unquote mother tongue, but my family comes from Jamaica, so in the Caribbean we speak a Patois language. People don't consider it to be a language, but I certainly do, because the way I approach English, I always approach it with my Jamaicanness. And there's been many times throughout my life where I've said English words incorrectly, or I use the inflection. It's not so much the word, it's the inflection and the emphasis, like where the emphasis is put on the word in Caribbean quote unquote dialects. It's just a different sound. So for me as an English speaker, I'm very attuned to sound. So I hear sounds and tonation and the semantics of the language. And for me, I often think the dominant culture. So the dominant English speaking people, they're often not aware of how their tone gets interpreted to people who are Caribbean descent in particular. We hear the semantics. So that's why when I hear something and I'm like, that sounded really racist, or that's a microaggression, they respond and say, I don't know what are you talking about? No, I didn't mean, and we're thinking, no, we heard that because we know semantics and we know tone and we know the little change of one little phrase. And I know even in Quebec with the allophones community, right? Those who speak French, English, and then a third language, they know it too. And the gift with those people is that they know it in both languages. So they could pick up the semantics in English and they pick up the semantics in French. But because they sit in this in between, you can see how they feel also doubly marginalized, because where's the space for them?
It's amazing how people are fiercely attached, as Vivian Gornick named her book, are fiercely attached to their way of speaking. I mean, it's like, sometimes I have to tweet something and I try to not put it in inclusive language, because I know that they won't answer me in relation with the subject I brought. They are going to tell me, well, but it's necessary to put that way, because they feel completely that the lenguaje inclusivo, it's like offensive. It's like restricted. They
also feel like it's sort of an assault on the Royal Spanish Academy of, on the formalized institution of Spain, which is interesting because especially if you talk to the activists, the millennials and under indigenous, writers, that to them, whatever the Spanish Academy feels about language is so irrelevant. I mean, language is like a living thing. It's not something to be regulated, something to be played with and something to. So it's interesting to see the generational disagreement with that, and just the fact that language is a fluid, mobile, living thing. It's not something that you regulate, and it's something that you play with. So
and I remember when I lived in Montreal. I growing up in Ontario, I learned French in school, but when I lived in Montreal, I started to take private lessons to learn it. I've lost pretty much all of what I've learned because I don't really speak it anymore. But it's interesting. And then having taken Spanish when I was in high school and learning a little bit of that, and then thinking about how in English, the thing about English is that English is like a remixed language. Like we take so much from so many different places. Like there's, especially if you're like Canadian English is not the same as British English. And it's not American English, but we take a little bit from each of those places. So some things we say in Canada, it's like, it's a little British and it's also a little American. And then it's also native to Canada. And what I love about—
very attractive.
Yeah. No, it's
very
amazing.
attractive to me.
It is amazing. So I'll give you an example. Like most people use the stereotype that Canadians say A, like we say A. But it's not. If you travel to Western Canada, they say hey. They don't say A. And then if you go out east, they say it in a different inflection. So they wouldn't say it the same way that we would say it in the center of the country. And so that's just like a little nuance that you won't know unless you travel coast to coast. And so for me, that's what I love about languages. Why? To Cecilia's point, why people would hold on to the language and say that it has to be this, or if it's not this. And I just don't get it at all. I just think, it's just like, was a couple of years ago that Jordan Peterson was like, oh, pronouns on that. It's like, what? And I just couldn't understand the whole conversation. They want you to call them they and them. What is that to your life? If a transgendered or a non-binary person says, I don't address me in the gendered he and her, they say use them and they, I say okay. Yet you have a whole bunch of people who say, oh, this is the end of democracy and
the end of language.
End of language.
Language is going to disappear.
Yeah, it's like, what are you on? You're not well. And to bring it back to a serious situation, we have to understand that over the last 50 years, narcissism has increased. the lack of empathy has increased. So there are generally a bunch of people, and not just that, sadism has increased, right? All these things that are an issue of ego have really increased over the last 40 to 50 years. So people are in their ego space. They're not in their heart space. So it's like everything is about them, and they're also into their personality. I'm actually explaining Donald Trump here, right? He's the poster child for being all in his ego, all in his personality, and just an inability to just let go of self and kind of see a community. You know, I just think the evolution in my own life that I've had over like transgendered identity, even in my own life, you know what we used to call transgendered people even 20 years ago, really negative language. And so for me, once I learned and grew and actually knew transgendered people personally, you start to see that, like you said earlier, Ingrid, their lives are on the margin. You know, it's a very precarious.
Well, actually, we work a lot in, well, you know, we have a conversation with another Canadian people, and we are things that we are really, ahead of times, and some we are really, I don't know, years and centuries before, like we don't have a free abortion. But at the same time, we have a lot of transgender persons in the state right now with this this government, and also at the INADI. Well, our director of politics, she's a girl, a woman transgender and a male transgender work together, and we did like some subsidize them, some support, because before, in Argentina, the life of most of the transgender people finish at 35, because the prostitution, it was the only way to get money. But now we have these people working in the government, going to universities. We have transgender people on TV, and we did quite a quick change. But at the same time, maybe, as we talked before, maybe the street, the language, it's going beyond, or maybe it's going very, very slow for some people. Some people don't accept that. They don't like that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we have this called quota, you say, cupo, like at the National Bank, we have like 35% quota for the transgender and also for women. So we are quite, I don't know, I think these kind of things happen everywhere, where there are some really like advanced in some, with some discriminations, and very bad with others.
Yeah,
At the same time, we have a lot of violence on women.
Yep.
That that's amazing. It's something that I can't believe that I even don't understand. Even I study to know, but I never get to the point. Why does it happen?
Yeah, I think in North America, Canada, and the US, we haven't reached that barrier. We're still dealing with those barriers, like institutionally. Like, I don't think there's any transgender politician that I know of in Canada. I'm not sure if there is. There might be just like one out of hundreds. And at the same time, the language has moved forward in terms of how we relate to them, right? So it's just the same thing with women. It's like in the North American context, women really aren't in our leadership roles in government and in business, like 50-50 with men. Yeah. But socially, women in North America seem pretty liberated, seem pretty free, right? To do whatever we want. Whereas if you look around the world, that's what it's so fascinating to me. Like, even if you look into like the global South, you look into like India and other places, women are really political. Like women are, and yet socially, you might say that women seem like they don't have as many rights. Yeah, it's a weird paradox how that happens. I don't know. I don't know how to explain that, and I don't know. But I wonder if that is related to the language. Like maybe if the language has something to do with that, and also the way that we, at least in the North American context, I still think we equate like leadership with masculine qualities. Like we just value masculine qualities more, whereas I feel like in other parts of the world, they value feminine qualities in their leaders too, like not just masculine qualities. Because even the women that end up in politics in the Canadian and American context, they tend to be a little bit more masculine in the way that they present themselves.
Yes.
Right. And it's just a weird, and yet you look at the culture and you look at the movies and it seems like the total opposite of that.
Yes.
I don't know how to explain that. I don't know. It's weird.
It's not like all the things go together.
No, and I think that's the key. It's like, change doesn't happen all at once. And I always like to compare it to the seasons. Like here we are I'm assuming in Argentina, I'm not sure if it's heading into winter, the winter. It's heading into spring.
Yeah,
right?
It's the opposite season. Exactly. It's just exactly.
That's right. So think about it. So you're heading into spring, we're heading into winter. Just because on December 21st, when they say, oh, okay, it's winter, that doesn't mean now every day it's going to snow and it's like automatically going to feel like winter. It's like it's going to happen over time. It's like it's going to be like slowly. And sometimes in Canada, winter doesn't feel like winter until January, or sometimes February, it doesn't feel like winter. And then suddenly it's winter and it's really cold and it's really intensely cold, right? So change is like that. It's just not, it doesn't just happen. Even though you make the law or you change something institutionally, it doesn't mean that the next day, look, nobody's hating anyone anymore. We've eliminated hate.
Well, as Ingrid asked at the beginning, and you said about don't go into the march and to the streets because you can right now, but I have the feelings that it's good to have these two times inside. One time, a slow one and trying to work like every day, every single day, think about, write a little bit, read a little bit, work on oneself. And on the other hand, going and insist, but it's kind of a drug. I mean, I feel completely overwhelmed. There are a feeling when you are with a lot of people on the street and screaming and chanting, and here also the feminist thing has this performatic style. So every single girl or woman probably are with their own, custom or their own, flyer. And this is as you asked me at the beginning, it's kind of addictive because there are something about the gimmick about the people together that is quite, I don't know, it's a terrible strength. I mean, it's like biological, it's a need. When you are, after going like each week, you feel like today where I gotta go. So
well, it's this idea of congregating and coming together, and also you're there to see and to be seen and to express and manifest your politics through your body is literally also your pancarte, your sort of your billboard, right? You're kind of you're presenting yourself in the cause, and it's meaningful because these are all acts of meaning, and it's and with the hope of achieving change, and the cause is noble. And but on that note, we're out of time, unfortunately, and this went by so fast. So I hope to continue. I hope that we keep continuing these conversations and this effort of uniting our knowledges and our experiences between these two opposite points of our side of the world. We're only separated by 2 hours, opposite seasons. But it's, what time do you have, Ceci, right now? You must have 10 o'clock, right, or 11 o'clock?
Well, I have to, yes. Yes, it's 10
10 o'clock, exact 10:10, so 8:10 here. So we're 2 hours apart, but there's a, that is one wonderful thing about the pandemic. As someone told me, when I first came here in the 90s, that we would be having this live conversation with a camera, and synchronic and reaching a lot of people. I mean, the possibilities are quite exciting at the same time, so to end on a hopeful note, it was my honor and pleasure to be with the two of you. And I hope that, you'll become friends and that we'll all continue to move forward. And Cheryl, I hope to that you can come to Argentina one day, and Ceci to come here in Montreal.
I would love to come to Argentina one day. In fact, I mean, I'm sorry to the vegetarians, but the beef. Oh my goodness!
No, I'm not vegetarian. You're invited to stay at my home. So tell me.
Perfect. We'll invite Cheryl for an asado, for
absolutely.
And not only that, the wine, and I mean everything. So exactly. And cheese. I mean, well, the cheese not as much, but the dairy products are very good as well. So and Ceci, we also really would love to have you here. Ceci's been doing a lot of work with me in bridging Argentina with Canada. This is our second panel. It's after an initial dialogue of doing this rapprochement between our countries, and that's very exciting. So on that note, everyone, I wish everybody a very good evening, that you keep enjoying the Salon du Livre and the series, the Mémoire pour l'Espoir series at Blumette. And have a nice evening, everyone. And see you soon.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.